Well, it's another So Clear Talk segment with Tom Madison and Derek Logue. And today I wanted to discuss something that's very important, something Tom and I have talked about really recently. Of course, as most of you know, Valerie Parkhurst passed away. We just kind of heard the news, and of course, most people's kind of got mixed feelings of it. Me personally, I've been very happy about her passing. She has been a thorn in our side for many, many years. Apparently, not everybody agrees with me, at least publicly. And, this brings up a very important discussion today because there seems to be an attitude within our movement that we can't do things like show anger or use terms like aggressive or, have feelings of elation when a moral enemy moves on and we don't have to deal with her anymore. For some reason, our movement some people within our movement, not everybody, of course, kind of has this holier-than-thou attitude that, we're supposed to behave in a certain way and not show certain emotions. And Tom and I both have experienced this attitude over the years, and I personally think it hinders our cause. First of all, we're only human. We're going to experience joy. We're going to experience anger. We're going to experience sadness. We're going to have times of depression. We're going to have times of joy in our lives. And, we're going to run the full range of human emotion. I'm sure, Tom, you've got your own experiences to share. Maybe you can think of an example or two where you dealt with, the one that comes to my mind is, maybe you can talk about this one is, when you played that Bill Blathers character, we used to do the training classes, you called it verbal aggressiveness training, but then people had complained that you used the term aggressive. And then later on, somebody complained. Yes, and then somebody complained about that the Bill Blathers character made a show called, quote unquote, Molester Mondays, and a couple of individuals, some higher ups from a particular group, thou shall remain unnamed for the sake of this conversation, complained to me personally. Didn't come to you directly, but came to me to complain, and begged us to change the name because it was offensive, and ultimately they still did. So maybe you can, if you want to add some details to that, go right ahead.
Well, I think I would. I was just thinking as you were describing all of that, I had forgotten some of it. I laughed under my breath when you mentioned Molester Mondays a second ago. But what I was thinking during the time you were introducing this recording today is going back in the history of our movement, the anti-sex offender registration law movement, way back to 2003, 2004, when here in Oregon we had put an end to the so hopeful Legal Defense Fund, which had been in Oregon, a local effort to repeal certain laws here or stop certain court actions and so forth, and had been somewhat successful, but that all ended. We started a new organization, So Hopeful International, which was going to take us away from the legal approach a little bit, although still using that as a basis for holding together the facts of our arguments and so forth, but taking it into a political category. So all of that was done around 2004. So Hopeful International became a highly opinionated place to be for fighting against the registry laws, and we had quite a few people join because they were happy to finally maybe be freed up from the legal / clinical / white lab coat type of approach. In other words, the approach that got us started and was good and it's factual and it's intelligent at its basis, but freed us up so we can talk politically with our opinions outside of the straight-jacketed legal approach, which has to be careful in its own arguments. It has to be careful to be not too emotional. It has to be very very straightforward. No, the So Hopeful International was an idea that said we're going to be political. We can express emotions like we were talking about earlier, Derek, that you were talking about earlier. That gave us the ability to be angry if we needed to be. Sometimes we shout with our words in writing, maybe with uppercase letters, or in an interview, maybe. That happens too. Or to show sadness or other kinds of grief and or concerns, worry, and all the rest of the spectrum of emotions. It's important. And in the political realm, which we are as anti-registry movement organizers, is trying to get the rest of the members of our movement to not only be careful legal opinionators, but also political agitators, emotional pontificators, if you want to use that word, but to stand up out in public maybe and raise the fist in the air, to shout, yell, criticize, condemn, raise questions, and raise the public ire, raise the public curiosity about what we're all about. That, I think that's what we're trying to do with the anti-registry movement. But I may be going on and on here, Derek, but what I guess I'm agreeing with you that there's two approaches and both are valid in their own categories, but we have to think political too, and yes, it's okay to be emotional.
Well, you experienced this, and I experienced this even with it, when we joined the protest a couple of weeks ago in Oakland, California. It was a great protest, but, we were approached by a certain somebody who was trying to, get us to, to be very careful about the things we say. And of course, when we did the protest last year, there was a lot of concern over the manner of the messages that we had. I mean, we had some very harsh signs out in public, especially in Oakland here a couple of weeks ago. And everything. And of course, some people get uncomfortable. Some people are going to get offended. I mean, that's part of the nature of a protest, is to have harsh messages that some people may or may not like. But, this one person in particular came up and wanted to make sure that we were very careful about the words that we said. And I really honestly didn't appreciate this person doing this. And I told him I try not to be really nasty about it, but I told him in so many uncertain terms, look, people's going to bring their own message to the table. And sometimes the message is going to be harsh. And, I honestly don't think that, to be blunt, that pussyfooting your way through this is getting us anywhere. All this respect, all this be careful with what you say, and don't rock the boat. Don't go after these sacred cows of the victim industry. Don't rattle the cage any. Yeah. I'm sick of the attitude, and I feel that this movement, quite frankly, has grown stale over the years with all this semantic nonsense.
Well, the reason it's grown somewhat stale, Derek, is that it, again, and I said it earlier, is that it tends to be to hold itself to this legal mindedness. And when I say legal mindedness, I'm not talking about the accuracy of the facts and the legal logic and reasoning. That's all good stuff. But the over carefulness, we can't do that. It'll discredit this and discredit that. We got to be careful. We won't be an organization very long if we criticize the powers that be. That kind of attitude. And I think that has to come to an end, or at least, when we are speaking legally or clinically or referring to those things, okay, put those facts out there. But if you're not yourself a lawyer, if you're not yourself a therapeutic clinician or a person with a PhD behind your name where you have to hold yourself to some higher standard, if you're just part of the rabble like I am, and the rest of us, I think most of us, is that you don't have to hold yourself to that ultra hyper carefulness. It's okay to be a person who expresses yourself in a much more vigorous fashion, and you're not under the same rules as the people that I just previously mentioned. With those people, professional careers that they have to watch out for. and that's fine. So we are freed up. So we need to think more politically. And you know, as you were speaking just a minute ago, I also had to happen to think about another group outside of what we do here in the anti-registry movement, politics that we do, and that is a group called Black Lives Matter. Some people hate them, some people love them. And if you'll, for a moment, let me say Black Lives Matter, if you'll subtract out their specific politics, if that's something that you're not going to agree with, look at their tactics, look at their strategies. I think those are beautiful strategies in that they are in the streets, sometimes blocking traffic. Sometimes they're occupying a government building of some sort. Some of them are getting arrested from time to time. To me, that sort of militantism, that sort of aggressive behavior, that is civil disobedience aggression, again, within that realm. I'm not talking about bloodying people's noses and throwing things at policemen, but I am talking about civil disobedience in a more aggressive way that we have not been in our movement. I think that's all good stuff, and bring that vociferous voice, that strident voice with you, and let's shout and yell in public and express ourselves.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of Black Lives Matter, but I will say this much. You know, the one thing that, you know, we walk a very fine line with the work that we do. You know, Tom and I, of course, we've done a number of demonstrations over the last 2 years now, in Florida, in New York, in Oregon. You know, then of course joining California RSOL in Oakland a couple of weeks ago, and you know, we try to make it clear that, you know, that these things are necessary, and you know, and everything. We bring harsh messages, but at the same time, we don't put people at risk of being arrested or hurt or anything like that, because obviously we recognize that as registered citizens, if we get arrested, the chances of us being detained for long periods of time is a lot higher, you know, just for simply engaging in these things. So, you know, we don't ask people to do acts of civil disobedience. You know, but to say that we have to go out there and we have to listen to people when they have harsh things to say about us and not get angry in response, to me is a ludicrous proposal. I mean, if somebody comes up and yells in your face, you know, what are you going to do? I mean, it's a normal human reaction.
Well, certainly, and it certainly is for those of us, and when you and I are on the streets, or our group of members are on the streets, don't think for 1 minute that those that oppose us, and let's face it, that's going to be 98% of everybody that walks by, those that come forward to say something, don't expect that it's going to be a pleasant, hello, how are you, and I disagree with you very nicely. It's going to be something of an insult. It's going to be somebody perhaps raising their voice and making a point about you being on the street and so forth. Our opponents are playing very aggressive politics against us, not just in the courtrooms and in the testimony tables, at the testimony tables in front of legislatures, but in the streets. And we have got to fight back at least at equal measure and face them with our own aggressive politics, with our voices and our messages on signs, and take this fight to the streets.
Well, I want to bring up another example, you know, from earlier this year, and that was when we went to the Tribeca Film Festival and we watched the Untouchable documentary, and you know, the producer had told us that the reason why he didn't put our message out there was because he felt it was too harsh. But yet we had to sit and listen to Ron Book talk about waterboarding individuals. And of course, my first thought is waterboarding. Hell, I'd like to take them and piss board them. You know, it's like waterboarding, except for, you know, it involves urine instead of water. You know, and people go, oh my God, I can't believe you said that. That's such a harsh thing to say. But you know what? I'm not supposed to get angry when I'm sitting here listening to this clown, you know, on the big screen talking about how he wants to torture and murder us just because we have an arbitrary label. And we're supposed to not be upset about it. We can be upset about it, but we can't express our anger. There's lots of other people with lots of different issues out there who express their anger, but yet for some reason, even people within our own movement feel that we shouldn't even have our own registered citizens that we work with on a regular basis trying to tell us that we don't even have the right to express our anger. And that's a problem. That's a huge problem with this movement.
Well, because I think our movement is fearful of our opponents, because our opponents are righteous. They have this righteous anger, and in that righteous anger is their protection of and the elevation of the sacred victim of sex abuse. And I have written, I have spoken about and against raising or elevating any group, any kind of individual above the law. When we elevate someone above the law, then we are basically saying that the law is not so important as the victim. In other words, the Constitution and or the statutes, all those things don't matter so much. We've got this special group here, and we're going to pay homage to that. We're going to protect that. It's more important than due process or any other things you might argue. That's where it all comes from. So this righteousness that protects the sacred victim is at the heart of what our opponents argue against us with, and that once we can break down that sacred victim, like we did in another radio recording before, is that if we can learn to effectively attack that and help make our opponents realize that that's not healthy for a nation that lives under a constitution, then I think we're all going to be better off for it.
Right. And, you used the Black Lives Matter example. I'll use another example that might appeal to, some people, the more conservative types. Well, I would look at, Jesus Christ. He got angry. He chased people out of the money. He chased the money chasers out of the temple. The Bible doesn't tell you not to be angry. It just simply tells you in your anger, do not sin, do not let the sun set on your anger. It doesn't tell you don't be angry. And Jesus certainly had his moments of anger. He cursed the fig tree, and stuff. So, and Jesus Christ looking at him as far as a revolutionary, from that standpoint, well, he didn't exactly change his attitude simply because some people didn't like his approach to things.
I tend to think I tend to think of Jesus as a revolutionary. I'm sorry, Derek, I interrupted. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, there's one speech that he gave in particular, which he said a very harsh thing, which is John chapter 6, where he talks about, that the bread of life is his flesh. And then, of course, people kind of mock what he said. Well, how can he give us his flesh to eat? Well, Jesus didn't back off and offer any explanation that this is just a metaphor. What he did was he turned around and repeated what he said about 4 times over. You'll have eternal life if you eat my flesh and drink my blood. It was like, and of course the response from people was, well, that's a pretty harsh saying. I don't really like what he had to say, and a whole bunch of people left. These big multitude of followers, thousands of people decided to leave him because his message was too harsh for them.
Well, I tend to put Jesus in the, not so much the religious category, as may seem absurd to some who are listening to this, but I tend to put him in the political category primarily. A political revolutionary was Jesus, and I put him in the same category with his revolution of a people's society, not one so much hierarchically organized as the Roman Empire was at the time, where there was more of a sharing of political power, more of a share of the economic pie, the productive pie of all the work being done, and shared more equally among the people. So he gets my vote as a political revolutionary alongside others in history, even more recent history, back 50 or 60 years ago, 7 years ago, Fidel Castro and Che Guevara in Cuba. Yes, they were violent in the sense of the murders that they committed, but in defense of the people of Cuba at the time. But and I'm not saying you have to murder people to be a revolutionary, but Jesus certainly was, again, in my way of looking at him, a highly favorable and iconoclastic type of revolutionary that certainly did make changes and so influenced his time on earth back then. 2,000-some years ago, supposedly, along with the other revolutionaries of his time, his cohorts, his apostles, and so forth, his contemporaries who also helped with that political movement back then became well known and later on greatly praised and raised up as more than just a revolutionary, but as a religious figure as we know him today.
Right. Well, how we ended up in the situation we're in the first place was because the people on the other side of this issue got angry. Walsh, Lunsford, all these other big names that we've come to know and despise over the years, they were effective because they used their anger towards the subject that they felt, was important in their lives. And we don't really do that within our movement. We kind of have this disdain for, raising our voice, for being aggressive, for being bold in our speech. And I do it because I show people that you can do it and get away with it. If nothing else, that's my purpose for being the way I am. I don't back down, even from people within our movement. And sometimes some of the harshest criticism that our movement gets is from individuals in it.
Well, it's as if our side of the debate regarding sex offender laws, we are almost officially assigned to be on the defensive. We can't be anything other than on the defensive. Our opponents are assigned on the offensive, and they get to attack, we get to defend, but we must never attack because our assigned roles is to defend. And I think that's really what's so wrong with what our movement has been so much of the time in the last 10 years is it's as if it's taken that as a definition of necessary behavior, and we cannot break out of being only on the defensive. How dare you be aggressive? How dare you be assertive? How dare you be out in public with signs that go against protecting children and all the rest of it? Well, we have to break out of that mold. We have to tell ourselves we can be defensive in some cases as appropriate in the argument of the moment, but also increasingly be on the offensive and push back and really, really take the fight to the sources of these, to the proponents of these sex offender registration laws. We need to take them on.
Right. Well, sometimes the best defense is a good offense, but sometimes when your offense sputters, having a really good defense is a pretty good thing. I mean, obviously, I know you're not a big sports fan, Tom, but I know you understand the game of football. Sometimes defense wins a ball game, and that was obviously the case at the Super Bowl this past year. Peyton Manning, those who know Peyton Manning, big name quarterback, probably played the worst game of his career. It was also the last game of his career. He didn't, his team won the Super Bowl, but he didn't win it by scoring touchdowns. The defense was, the defense had done most of the work, and yes, you could be on the defensive and still score. You can get an interception, get a fumble, run it back for a touchdown or whatever, and stuff. But I think our defense plays a little too conservatively at times, and in a game of football, conservative play calling sometimes comes back to haunt teams. They're up by a couple of scores, and so they're just trying to kill the clock, and then all of a sudden the other side gains momentum. And I feel like that's kind of what's happened with our movement in the last couple of years. We're all about this pomp and circumstance, and we have meetings and conferences, and we're not being aggressive enough.
Yeah, exactly. And it's as if we have this reputation to protect. What reputation? What
reputation?
We are. And I've said this to you before in other conversations. It's as if we think of ourselves in the anti-registry movement as having a couple of $1 million or $1 billion in the bank. We're internationally renowned. We have a stature and a public persona of a certain high level, and we have to protect that at all costs. I mean, if we say something wrong, our reputation will be shattered. And the opposite is true. I mean, we are a small ragtag group of people across the country. We barely have enough money to buy a roll of toilet tissue. We're not doing that great politically and in other ways. We have come a long way. I mean, from a nothing to a something. We do have legal arguments and websites and groups that have done decent work, but there's no reputation to protect. So why do we continue with the mindset that we have this reputation that has to be protected at all costs, and therefore we have to be very conservative and very careful defensively to argue our political points and our legal points? Well, for the rank and file, we have to, again, I've said this numbers of times, we have to kind of take that into account and not believe that we have this great reputation that needs protecting. There is no reputation that we have to protect. We have to get out there and be in addition to a legal movement, which has to be somewhat careful, let's say, is to expand into the political arena, as I've been saying.
Right. Well, I want to wind down this part of our, this half of the conversation because we still have another subject to cover in our talk today. But I want to end it by, I wanted to end it by bringing something up. During the course of listening to, let me start this over here. I'm having a little tongue tied here. In the course of writing my AWA article, 10 years at the Adam Walsh Act, I had stumbled across Mary Duvall's radio show. Again, I hadn't listened to it in a while. I mean, obviously Mary Duvall's been, she's been dead for 5 years now. She's passed away, and she was a warrior, fighting for our cause all the way up till she died. And this recording that she did was about, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 months before her death. And, she was on this radio show that she used to do, and people were calling in, and the people were hungry. This is 5 years ago. This is 2011. People were hungry for something. We were talking about a march on Washington. There were plans in the works, I think, for and Families Against Mandatory Minimums, and maybe 1 or 2 other groups were trying to organize this march on D.C. People were talking about all these ideas about, things we could be doing. And here it is, 2016, and you hear the opposite. What the hell happened to this movement? And that's something I would love to have a discussion in the future about it. I know that you and I, Tom, we could probably talk about that all night. But, that's something I want people to think about.
Well, we need to get our chutzpah back. We need to get our courage back. It's as if we lost our courage somehow, and somehow it's not something that can be found. And, of course, yes, it can be rediscovered and reinitiated. And so stay tuned to these radio casts here at So Clear Media, and you'll find, I think, more and more words of encouragement in that direction.
That's all, folks.